So Trump posted this tweet. It showed a video of a bunch of people standing in a big circle. And then we saw the footage and boom, the massive explosion. They're all gone. Can you tell me, what did that video show? What were we looking at?
Yeah, well, clearly it wasn't, some Houthi missile commanders standing in a circle outside. I mean, that's just absurd. Please, give me a break. Anybody look at that, and if Trump believes that that's what it was, then that doesn't really speak very well of Trump's judgment. Let's just say, I don't know what it was. I've heard that it may have been some sort of ethnic religious sort of event, something to mark the end of Ramadan. And that makes a whole lot more sense to me than the idea that this was, that this is some sort of conference of the Houthi military. That doesn't make a bit of sense. I mean, really, why do you stand in a large circle like that outside? Does somebody make a decision and you whisper to the guy next to him and it goes around the circle or something? It's just beyond absurd.
Right. Now, that's what I saw as well. Most people were saying that this was a celebration for the end of Ramadan, for the Eid festival. Which, if that's the case, because I believe that's true, and I haven't seen really anything to say to prove that this was some type of military
it
gathering.
Could not have been.
Right.
Yeah.
But then it just struck me that how the president of the United States would show what is a war crime, and publicly, and the way that he tweeted about it, saying, oops, they're not like, it's been bothering me, because I remember when I was in college, when the WikiLeaks came out, and I saw war footage from Iraq where U.S. soldiers were in helicopters and gunships and gunned down some people, and then an ambulance came to try to pick them up, and they gunned it down too. Right. There's maybe 10 people or something like this that were killed, and I was like, this is messed up. I can't believe that this is happening, and that was a big story.
Right.
That this happened, that we saw this footage of a war crime committed by the United States in Iraq. And then here we are, just 15 years later or so, and the president of the United States himself is tweeting it. We don't need Julian Assange to show it for us. Our president is showing it, and
right.
There's no real. There's just people accept it, and that's a worrying state of affairs for me. Like, why? How we've gotten to that point where we can just accept let's tweet out war crimes and laugh about it, and everybody's like, yeah, hoorah, when just 15 years ago we saw similar footage and we're like, this is horrible, this is a big problem, it's a big scandal, the WikiLeaks. Does it just speak to just the moral degradation of our country?
Yeah, there's no question about it. There's clearly has been a steady lowering of ethical standards and an increasing callousness, and I really should say barbarism too. I mean, it certainly precedes the attack on Gaza, but I think it has been accelerated by the attack on Gaza and on Lebanon. And I think I made the point earlier. I mean, we're talking about how maybe this can really wake people up. And it certainly has had that effect on certain people within the West, in the US and in Europe, people that were kind of sitting on the fence, including a friend of mine. But after this, he says, oh God, this is genocide. They woke up to the horrors of the Israeli occupation and ethnic cleansing. But the problem is, that these horrors can also, there's always a danger. And I think what we're seeing, this danger be realized right now, a danger of actually of which comes with complicity. If you don't stop and say, wait a second, this is wrong, and make a stand against it, you become complicit in the crimes. And with the complicity, there is a growing callousness. And you begin to adopt the mindset, of that, of the perpetrators of these terrible crimes. And I think that's, That's what we're seeing. Again, I think you're right. It's just actually things happen every day now that would have caused a huge reaction in the past. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, no question about it. Or, like you say, 15 years ago, too. But now, in general, there's silence. There's just the chirping of crickets, or there's outright applause. Like in the case of the pager attacks, where it's just celebrated. By so many people among supporters of Israel.
Right. It seems like we've just learned to close our hearts and minds to these atrocities. And there might be a problem with just the fact that if you keep on doing it and nothing has happened, you just kind of get acclimated to it. Like the footage coming out of Gaza is just so horrific. I just saw footage yesterday of where they bombed a journalist tent and a guy's being burned alive. And it's just like, my goodness. And then you see, just children missing a head or limbs, toddlers. And they use this language like, we eliminated, I think, a 2-year-old that they said is the grandson of some Hamas official or something. They use the word, we eliminated him. And he's a two-year-old boy. What is going on? And then it just keeps on coming out and nothing happens. And then the more that it keeps coming out and that they realize that nobody's doing anything except the Houthis, that, we can just keep on that. You have to push through. And like you said, maybe there's that idea, that callousness. Once you have a certain amount of blood on your hand, you can't look back and say like, I was rooting for a genocide and I was supporting this. You have to just really close yourself off and be like, we got to do this. These people are evil. They're Amalek. We will adopt the Israeli point of view on this. And they just, all of them must be exterminated. There are no innocents. And it's horrifying. It's just so horrifying that it's happening today, this day and age, when we can see it. Like the atrocities that happened in World War II, they weren't being broadcast to the world. But here they are, and we're not doing anything.
No, it is horrifying. It's interesting. One exception to this trend is the story about the horrifying story of the different rescue workers that were killed, deliberately murdered by the IDF. Right. But what happened? So first, they were getting reports from the Palestinians that this had happened. The IDF just denied it, or they said, okay, well, there were some emergency vehicles, but they didn't have their lights on and they were behaving suspiciously. But then, these bodies were dug up. First of all, let's say that they were buried, and then and their emergency vehicles were buried, or at least partially had been crushed and then buried next to them. So, this was clearly an attempt to cover up a crime. How else can you explain this? One of the bodies, they found a phone. It was like one of the victims had actually been filming, the incident before he was killed himself. It's very, very hard. I didn't listen to it, but I've heard it's very, very hard to listen.
I listened to it. It was very difficult to listen to.
Yeah, because at the end, he knew that he was going to be killed too. And he's just sort of like trying to make his peace with God and with this, his loved ones, since he knew that his end was near. And they found, there was a bullet in his brain. But I guess before they killed him, he put his phone in his pocket, and then that was recovered. Now, the thing, this is a horrible, horrible, horrible atrocity. But what makes it different is that this one actually is getting coverage in the U.S. It was reported in the New York Times and in the Guardian in Britain. I've actually, I read the whole Guardian article. They didn't pull any punches. They described the whole timeline. It's even, more horrible than I've described. This is an exception. Now, things like this happen, unfortunately, all the time. Again, there have been, you mentioned the journalists, there have been more journalists killed in Gaza than in all of World War II. It's clear that it's been deliberate. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, medical workers that have been killed. The entire hospital's destroyed. This is something that goes on. But this one incident actually, has been reported. And the other ones have been just ignored or downplayed or, kind of presented with a lot of spin. It's complicated or whatever, even when it wasn't complicated. So that's interesting that happened. It may just, it's hard for me to, you can hope, maybe in some case, some of these people, these journalists that have been working for these mainstream organizations, they've seen enough and they're starting to report it. That
The
could
journalists
happen.
themselves, when
Yeah,
they see
you would
journalists
hope.
getting killed, you think
Right.
like, whoa, this isn't okay, right? They're burning
Right.
this journalist alive. That's
Right.
shouldn't I have my duty to report it or be like, oh,
Yeah.
it's Hamas's fault. I'm so sick of that. This everything is Hamas's fault.
Right.
Like, who's
Right.
dropping the bombs? Who's killing the women and children?
Like here, you just had irrefutable proof, and it just couldn't. The IDF just keeps on backtracking. And now they admit, okay, because the footage showed that the lights were on and the vehicles were clearly marked and whatever. So the IDF had been lying. They were caught in a lie, but then they came up with other lies, and they've been caught in those too. And now, so Israel in this case is forced to say, oh, there's something, clearly somebody made some mistakes and we'll investigate, which they always say. And at the most, somebody's going to get a slap on the wrist and the whole thing will be forgotten, unfortunately. If past history is a guide, again, just the fact that this report was reported was really unusual. And, but I have to say that's a little glimmer, an example of, maybe the horrors are waking certain people up. Let's hope so. You could have a more cynical analysis, and it may be that they just letting this out because there is a lot of anger directed at Netanyahu. There's no question about it. And his breaking of the ceasefire, because that also ended the hostage deal. So you find there's a lot of anger within Israel against Netanyahu, and also against Netanyahu outside of Israel as well. So maybe the cynical point of view, and I guess I'm not going to argue this. I think that like those reporters, they just reported honestly, and they themselves were horrified. But there could be people that use this just against Netanyahu. And then once they get Netanyahu out of there, then, things will continue. I know that's cynical, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be cynical here.
Yeah. And what worries me a bit is that if Trump is just completely hook, line, and sinker is bought into the Israeli narrative and just full Zionist, will never, talk about these atrocities and crimes that Israel is perpetrating on the Palestinians, that so many Americans that have put all their faith in Trump will just go with him hook, line, and sinker as well. Yeah. Like he has such a cold personality with him that many people have just abdicated all of their critical thinking skills, empathy, whatever. It's all, so they put their soul into Trump, and Trump is their savior. And, that's it. So anything he says, he's infallible. And they can't separate the man from his policies, just like, let's look at everything he's doing. If you like some of the Doge stuff, great. But are you America first? How is this what we're seeing in Gaza, America first? How is what we're seeing in Yemen, America first, or Iran? And there seems to be this inability for so many people that have just, everything, just the whole story of Trump over the past 10 years has just been wild. And so he has been elevated into this, this huge figure, which we talked about before, just sort of fueling into his megalomania, and the assassination attempt, the lawfare against him, everything. I understand where a lot of people are just furious at everything that's been thrown at Trump before, and they want to put everything behind him. And that's what worries me, because I think a lot of these people are not necessarily bad people, but they have decided just to be like, whatever Trump does, that's our leader. He's our new Jesus. That's what it is. And that's a scary thing for me. And I feel like he'll always have that support, which will keep him moving forward on some of these things.
Yeah. No, I think you're correct. I don't disagree.